Hello and welcome to this module on Optional Practical Training, or OPT, as it's also known. In this module, we will discuss various aspects of OPT, including eligibility for OPT, the timeline and application process, reporting requirements, travel, status maintenance, and potential extensions. But to start us off, let's talk about what OPT is and who can use it. So OPT is a work authorization. It's also a benefit of your F1 status, and it allows you to work for up to 12 months in your field of study. And later in this module, we'll talk a little bit more about the kinds of employment that you can do while on OPT. You are allowed to apply for OPT once per higher educational level. So, for instance, if you did a master's degree in the US and you used OPT after your master's degree, and now you are completing your PhD, you are allowed to apply for OPT again because you're completing a higher educational level. Now, if you apply for OPT after your PhD, and then in the future you decide to do another degree, maybe a master's degree, at that point, though, you could no longer apply for OPT because you've already used it at a higher degree level. So you are allowed once per each educational level, but you must always be going towards a higher educational level. You also cannot bank unused OPT. So let's say you did a master's degree in the US and you did not use your OPT after your master's level, and now you're finishing your PhD. You can apply for OPT based on your PhD, but you cannot recapture the time from your master's degree that you did not use. So it's use it or lose it. There are several different categories of OPT. This module is going to focus on post-completion OPT, which is done after completing coursework or degree requirements. But I'll talk briefly about a few other kinds of OPT. One is pre-completion OPT. So this is for students who have not yet satisfied degree requirements. It's primarily used in scenarios where a student has a good opportunity that's relevant to their major, but it is not, or their program rather, does not have a pathway for CPT. The disadvantage of pre-completion OPT is that you lose some time off of your post-completion OPT, and that's a reason why it's not very common, but it is an option. There are two possible extensions of OPT. There's a STEM extension, and this is for students who have a major that is designated as STEM by the US Department of Homeland Security. If you're eligible, you can potentially have an extension of 24 months added on to your post-completion OPT. There's also a cap-gap extension, which is not major specific, but it does apply to students whose employer is going to participate in the H-1B lottery. In that scenario, you may be eligible for a temporary extension of your OPT. We'll talk a little bit more about STEM OPT and the cap-gap extension at the end of the module. But for the majority of this module, again, we're going to be focused on post-completion OPT. Now, how do you know if you're eligible for OPT? You must be an F1 student in valid F1 status. You must have been enrolled for full-time for at least one academic year on your current CVIS ID. So if you ever took a leave of absence and returned on a new CVIS ID, you'll want to check with your advisor because that could impact your eligibility for OPT because it is based on your current CVIS ID. So sometimes taking a gap semester or a gap year can impact your ability to do OPT. You also have to be working towards the completion of your degree program. The application must be timely filed, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then CPT in general should not impact most people's eligibility for OPT, but in some cases it can. If you have done 365 days or more of full-time CPT at your current degree level, you do lose your eligibility for OPT. Now, sometimes students panic a bit when they see that, but most students at Vanderbilt would not be in this scenario. It is something that we monitor, but it's kind of rare. It is specific, so it's 365 days or more. It's full-time CPT only, not part-time, and it's only looking at your current degree level. So if you did a master's degree in the US and you did some full-time CPT there, that time does not carry over into your PhD. When you're applying for OPT based on your PhD, you're only looking at the CPT that you've done at the PhD level. And then again, you cannot have already used OPT at your current level or at a higher level. So now let's talk about timelines. There are very specific timelines for post-completion OPT. I'll start off by saying that the earlier you apply, the better. We'll talk in detail about why that is, but in general, you should know that the OPT applications are processed by a U.S. government agency called United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. And their processing times can be inconsistent. For some people, it can take as little as a few weeks. For others, it could take up to 3 to 5 months. So to allow yourself the most flexibility and the best chance of having your work authorization when you want to have it, it's in your best advantage to file early. Your filing window begins 90 days before the end of your program, and it ends 60 days after. So that gives you a window of about 5 months. You cannot file before that window begins, and you cannot file after it ends. In addition, you must be physically present in the US to file. So that's important because if you have plans to travel outside of the US after graduation, you want to make sure that you file your application before you leave the US. You cannot file from outside of the US. And furthermore, if you leave the US after graduation, your F1 status ends and you won't be able to return to file for your OPT. So make sure that you factor that into any travel plans that you have around your graduation time. Now, I mentioned the program end date. So you have some flexibility as a thesis or dissertation student on what this end date means. So you can use your actual graduation date. So if you are graduating in May 2025 with the spring graduates, you can use that date. However, if you have finished all of your courses and you're only working on your thesis or your dissertation, you could also choose an earlier date. You could choose your defense date. You could choose the date of your final submission to the graduate school. There are some benefits and disadvantages to doing so, but you do have that option. If you do want to choose an end date that is earlier than your graduation date, as part of your OPT application to ISSS, you must provide an approval letter from your DGS. And this is because if you choose an earlier end date, we are required to shorten your I-20, And that means that any on-campus employment must end on that date as well. So if you are a TA or an RA, you won't be able to continue working after that point. And that's also important for your department to know. So we want to make sure that they are aware and they are okay with that. Um, there are some things that you'd want to consider before deciding to end your program early. We call this early completion OPT. For some people, it might make sense because maybe they have a job offer that needs them to start before their graduation date. For other people, though, especially if they don't have a job offer yet, it may not be a great idea. A few things to consider. You must remain enrolled in zero credit research at least until the end date in your I-20. So if you are planning to keep your end date as your graduation date, you must remain enrolled until that date. And keep in mind, if you're enrolled, that means you're charged tuition, student fees, health insurance. If you're at the point in your program where you no longer have funding from Vanderbilt, that could be a consideration because maybe that's an expense that you have to cover. So you'd want to think about that. I mentioned the on-campus employment. If your I-20 is shortened, your on-campus employment will end sooner as well. We do require that your defense date at least be scheduled before you apply for OPT. One reason for this is, you are allowed under the regulations to continue working on your dissertation after or after your I-20 end date and while you're on OPT. But if you have a significant amount of work left on your dissertation, um, you may not want to choose early completion OPT. And that's because if you're at the end of your OPT and you still have not defended or completed your dissertation, your F1 status can no longer be extended at that point. So you really want to make sure that you've discussed with your department and your advisor that you do have a defense date. Um, and again, if you have a job offer, early completion OPT may make sense. But if you don't have a job offer, it may not make sense because, the sooner that you end your I-20, the sooner you're expected to start your OPT. We'll talk more later about unemployment and that impact on your OPT. But that's something to keep in mind. Another consideration is that for a lot of academic positions, including postdoc positions, you may actually be required to have the PhD conferred in order to be eligible. So if that's the case, early completion OPT may not be a good idea. Now, of course, always feel free to consult with your ISSS advisor. We're always happy to talk through some scenarios to try to figure out if this makes sense or if it doesn't. Now, to give you an idea of how OPT timelines work, here's a chart. So basically, you'll figure out your end date, whether that's graduation, your defense date, or another date. Your filing window opens 90 days before that, and it ends 60 days after. So you need to establish your end date before you even start putting your application together, because that's going to determine your filing window. You must choose a start date for your OPT that is within the 60-day grace period after your program end date. So even let's say you're choosing the May graduation date as your end date, and let's say your job starts in August, you still are restricted to choosing a start date that's within the 60-day grace period. And then there's a regulation that says that your OPT cannot end more than 14 months after your program end date. That does not mean that you get 14 months of OPT. Rather, it just means that the latest possible end date would be 14 months after your program end date. Now, let's put some real dates in here to make a little bit more sense out of that. So let's say we have a student who is graduating on May 9, 2025. So their filing window opens 90 days before, so it would start on February 8th, and then it ends 60 days after, or July 8th. So you cannot file before February 8th in this case, and you cannot file after July 8th. Now, the possible start dates that you could choose based on a May 9th end date would be May 10 through July 8th. So you have to make sure that the start date that you choose is within that date range. Now, the latest possible end date would be July 7, 2026. Now, you only get 12 months maximum of post-completion OPT. But this end date will become important when we consider possible delays. So I mentioned that USCIS can sometimes take as long as 3 to 5 months to process an OPT application. So let's say that you file as early as you can in February, and you choose a June 1 start date. If it takes 3 months for USCIS to process your OPT application, then that means you should have your OPT approval and your EAD, the work authorization card, sometime in May, and you'd have that before your June 1 start date. And then you'd get 12 months of OPT, meaning that your OPT would end on May 31st, 2026. Now, let's say you're still deciding what you want to do after graduation, and you decide to file for OPT in May. And you choose the latest possible start date, which would be July 8th. Well, if you file in May and it takes USCIS 3 months to process your application, you might not receive anything until August. So if that happens, USCIS will adjust your start date to the date on which they approve your OPT. So let's say in this case, it's August 15. However, because of that 14-month rule, they'll only give you July 7, 2026 as the end date. So the takeaway there is that if you file later in your filing window, you can legally do that, but you could lose some of your OPT time. So you'd want to factor that in as you think about when you're going to file for OPT. Another thing to consider, if you file early, and let's say for whatever reason USCIS denies your application, if you filed in February and USCIS informs you in May that your application has been denied, you're still within your filing window, so you can reapply if you want. If you waited until May to file, and you find out in August that your application was denied, you're outside of your filing window, so you cannot refile. The other thing is you'll notice you're also outside of your grace period, so your F1 status is over as well. So again, the takeaway is that filing late can have some risk attached to it. It may make sense to file late in some situations, but you are assuming some risk. Now, remember the filing window is very important. You must file within it. If you file outside of your window, USCIS will deny your application. There's an additional filing timeline. USCIS must also receive your application within 30 days of the I-20 issue date. So that basically means once you get your I-20 for OPT from ISSS, do not delay filing. If you're not sure about if you're going to file or you think you might wait a little bit, talk to your ISSS advisor. It might make more sense to just wait um, to request your I-20 when you're sure. Because if USCIS receives it after that 30-day window, they will deny your application. So once you get your OPT I-20, you want to make sure that you go ahead and file. You don't want to just wait. If something comes up and you want to delay filing, let your ISSS advisor know so that we can issue a new I-20 for you. And then once again, just to stress, the later you file, the more risk you assume. You could lose time from your OPT because of that 14-month rule. And then depending on when your application is denied, if you're outside of your filing window, you cannot refile and you may not have F1 status anymore. So you really want to consider filing early if you can. It just gives you more options just in case something goes wrong.